Hi, folks. Don Paul Weather Plus. And today's segment is going to be Don Paul Climate Plus. And what touched me off to do this segment is an article I just ran across from Yale University's Climate Connections concerning a place dear to my heart, my wife's heart, Glacier National Park. We visited this gorgeous national park in northern Montana on the Canadian border just last month. And of course, as a meteorologist, I knew before we got out there, and my wife knew it too, she teaches some earth science, that the glaciers were shrinking. And in fact, they're shrinking a lot. There are now 26 glaciers left. Back in the year 1910, when the park opened, there were 100 glaciers. The 26 remaining are all melting, all at different rates due to varying conditions. But what led to some confusion and some totally fallacious claims from a denialist blog tied to a non existent, that is, phony university, that the glaciers were growing and that the National Park Service and the U.S. Geological Survey are involved in a big lie conspiracy to mask the growth of these glaciers so that you wouldn't know the world is not really warming up. Well, of course, these are false claims from people whose ethics could use a little work. The park, as it was in the early part of this 21st century, was predicting that the glaciers could be gone as soon as the year 2020, next year. Well, within a few years, part of the scientific method, peer review, made it plain that this was going to be a bad prediction. One of the problems with it was that it ignored, as glaciers retreat, they retreat to a higher altitude, where the temperature is, I don't mean to insult your intelligence, colder. So while these denialists, based on some fuzzy cell phone temperatures, put out some gibberish about Grinnell Glacier, one of the larger glaciers, having grown by 30% since the year 2009, and then have been spreading this not only on their own blog, but have been posting it on other websites. The truth of the matter remains, as I said at the outset, all the glaciers are shrinking. And as for the Grinnell Glacier, the data shows that the overall shrinkage there has been 8.4% between 2005 and 2015. Over the longer haul, let's look at a couple of photographs. Here is the Grinnell Glacier in 1910. Pretty extensive, as you can see. Here it is in 2017 from the same photographic vantage point. Before, now. And all this is inevitable because of the warming which is occurring not just in northern Montana, but is occurring across much of the lower 48, most parts of the northern hemisphere, not all parts equally. Some parts of the globe are not experiencing that much warming. In fact, for example, western New York's warming is less significant than the warming has been in northern Montana. We're not going to have the time to get into as to why that is the case, but the fact that these denialist blogs seem to be increasing as the evidence that they are entirely wrong seems to be a last gasp effort to tell the big lie from little sources. There are a few meteorologists who do not agree that human activity is the main forcing mechanism, but even two of the most renowned of these denialist meteorologists, who are scientists, agree there is warming. They just say it's not us. And I want to get into a little bit of that as to why it most certainly is us. The denialists often mention there were plenty of glacial advances and retreats for hundreds of thousands and millions of years prior to human activity. So why would this warming period be any different? Well, here's why. The Earth's orbit has eccentricities that are highly predictable. It is not a circular orbit all of the time. Over 26,000 years, the Earth's orbit goes from elliptical to circular and back again, and it takes 26,000 years. And during that transition in the change of the shape of the orbit, the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth changes quite a bit, not in the snap of a finger, but that alone is a major factor in glacial advances during less solar energy and retreat during increased solar energy. There also is an eccentricity in the tilt of the axis, which is always listed in geography books as 23.5%, degrees, I should say. Well, it is now, but in a slow cycle, the tilt of the axis changes to much less of a tilt to more of a tilt. The current 23.5 degrees, which will last for quite some time, over tens of thousands of years, becomes less, becomes more, changes the amount of solar input into the northern hemisphere. And I'm just talking about two changes in the Earth's place in this solar system. Both are highly predictable. This is not guesswork. So here's what we know about those eccentricities being highly predictable. The Earth's current place in its orbit in that 26,000-year cycle and the tilt of the axis, as it is now, both would dictate, if it were not for human activity, the world would be cooling. It would have been cooling for this last century, before that, and for centuries to come. We know the only explanation for the warming is the increase in greenhouse gases released from human activity. And it's not all some evil conspiracy. Economies expand. Fossil fuel consumption continues to expand, not so much in the United States or in Europe, as I wrote in a recent Buffalo News article, but because economies grow. China has been the biggest user of coal for some time. India, second, we're a distant third. Now, China is leading the way in solar technology because they lose tens of thousands of people to horrific air pollution episodes around some of their biggest cities. So they are expanding alternative technologies, but their economy is expanding to the extent where the increase in the need for power generation and for factories which burn fuel is outweighing their alternative technology reductions. And there's no sign that the total output of the greenhouse gases is going to suddenly reverse. It can slow down, and that would make a big difference in how bad things get after you and I are gone. But the bottom line is, past glacial advances and retreats were tied to the Earth's orbit, the tilt of the axis, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from natural sources, and were part of a natural cycle. The current warming is not part of a natural cycle. If it weren't for us, if CO2 were back where it was in the 1870s, the world would be cooling now. We are the difference. And so I'm not here to pontificate about the evils of industrial society. It's just the way it is. We do, I think most of us can agree, need to find a way to slow down the growth in our greenhouse emissions. But again, if it weren't for what humans are doing, the world would be cooling. So this idea that it's always been a natural cycle, that was true up until the 19th century. It's not true now and won't be for some time to come. Thanks for listening this far, and be suspicious if you see websites, blogs saying this is all wrong, the world isn't warming up, and we have nothing to do with whatever warming is occurring. It's just all natural. Mm-mm.